Welcome, friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, unwinding after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet companion, you found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Perhaps you're wrapped in a blanket, sitting by a softly lit window, or resting somewhere under an open sky. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, comfortable, and ready to wander with me into the ancient geological origins of the minerals that would one day cradle human dreams. If you find peace or curiosity in these gentle stories, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a moment of stillness too. And to those who've already joined along, thank you. Deep beneath the surface of the cooling Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, the first quartz crystals begin their patient formation. Silicon and oxygen atoms arrange themselves in perfect hexagonal lattices, molecule by molecule. As magma chambers slowly surrender their heat to the surrounding rock, each crystal grows at the pace of geological time itself, perhaps a few atoms per century, building structures that will outlast continents and witness the rise and fall of entire evolutionary epochs. The process requires such extraordinary stillness that it makes the deepest human meditation seem restless by comparison. Too much movement, too rapid cooling, and the crystals shatter before they form their first complete faces. Instead, they need the kind of profound quiet that exists only in the planet's deepest spaces, where pressure holds everything in perfect suspension and time moves with the weight of stone. Here, in chambers that will never know sunlight, in caverns that predate the very concept of day and night, quartz develops its peculiar property of piezoelectricity, the ability to generate tiny electrical fields when compressed, a phenomenon that modern sleep researchers find echoed in the brain's own electrical rhythms during the deepest phases of rest. The temperatures in these crystalline nurseries hover just above the melting point of rock, creating conditions so precise that a difference of mere degrees determines whether the silicon and oxygen will form quartz, feldspar, or dissolve back into the molten matrix entirely. The cooling happens with such glacial slowness that individual crystals can maintain their growth for millions of years without interruption, their faces expanding outward like frozen flowers blooming in geological time. Some of these ancient crystals, when eventually exposed by erosion and tectonic upheaval, reveal growth patterns that chronicle the planet's cooling history layer upon microscopic layer, recording changes in temperature, pressure, and chemical composition across eons. Scientists still puzzle over why these particular minerals should resonate so strongly with human neural activity. Why certain frequencies generated by compressed quartz should mirror the brain waves of REM sleep so closely. Some theorize that our nervous systems, evolved in a world rich with crystalline structures, naturally attuned to similar frequencies, that consciousness itself may be partially calibrated to the electrical signatures of the mineral kingdom. The mystery deepens when researchers observe how quartz formations seem to cluster in areas where underground water moves most slowly. In the deepest aquifers, where liquid has remained undisturbed for millennia, these subterranean waterways move through the crystal beds like liquid time itself, carrying dissolved minerals in concentrations so dilute that a single drop might contain only a few atoms of any given element. Yet, over millions of years, this gentle circulation redistributes the building blocks of crystals across vast distances, creating networks of mineral veins that span entire continents. The water moves so slowly that radioactive dating reveals some droplets have been traveling through the same rock formations since before complex life emerged on the surface, ancient moisture that has never seen sky, never felt wind, never known anything but the patient darkness of stone. In these depths, the boundary between liquid and solid becomes strangely fluid. Water at such pressures and temperatures exists in states that surface chemistry cannot replicate, neither entirely liquid nor entirely vapor, but something in between that moves through microscopic cracks in the crystal lattice like a mineral ghost. This phantom water carries information in its molecular structure, preserving chemical signatures of the conditions under which it first formed, creating a kind of geological memory that extends back to the Earth's earliest cooling phases. The crystal formations themselves serve as libraries of this ancient information. Each face, each internal inclusion, each microscopic flaw preserves a record of the exact moment it formed, the temperature, the pressure, the chemical composition of the surrounding environment. Geologists can read these crystalline texts like books written in stone, deciphering the planet's autobiography one mineral grain at a time. Some crystals contain tiny pockets of primordial water, sealed within their structure for billions of years, time capsules containing samples of the very first oceans, preserved in perfect darkness and silence. Only took 1 billion years to perfect the recipe for these sleeping stones. Only required the patience of an entire planet holding its breath while molten rock slowly learned the art of stillness. Only needed the kind of silence that makes even mountains seem restless by comparison, the kind of quiet that exists in spaces where sound itself has never traveled. The crystals grow in this perfect darkness, never hurrying, never pausing, accumulating their geometric dreams one atomic layer at a time, building structures that will eventually surface to catch moonlight and starlight in their faceted faces. Modern sleep laboratories measure brain activity with electrodes that rely on the same piezoelectric properties these ancient crystals developed in their subterranean cradles. The connection feels less like coincidence and more like recognition, as if consciousness naturally seeks the frequencies that the Earth itself has been generating since its youth. In the deepest stages of sleep, human brain waves sometimes synchronize with the subtle electrical rhythms of the mineral world, creating momentary harmonies between the electricity of dreams and the patient pulse of stone. The crystals continue growing even now, in chambers so deep that their formation will not be complete for millions more years. They accumulate time like sediment, layer by microscopic layer, building toward a geometric perfection that exists beyond human scales of measurement. In the absolute darkness of their formation, they create their own kind of light, not visible illumination, but the electromagnetic glow of atoms finding their proper places in the universal lattice of matter, seeking its most restful arrangement. The Earth turns in its primordial dance 4 billion years ago, when the moon hangs closer in the sky and tidal forces move with 10 times their modern strength. Vast oceans surge and retreat across the young continents twice each day, creating rhythms that will become the planet's first metronome. These ancient tides rise and fall with such dramatic force that entire coastlines disappear beneath churning waters, only to emerge again hours later, their surfaces carved and polished by the regular breathing of the world. In the shallow seas that cover most of the planetary surface, the twice-daily cycle of advance and retreat creates the first reliable patterns in Earth's chaotic youth. Where modern tides might shift a few meters of shoreline, these primordial surges move inland for kilometers, transforming vast plains into temporary ocean floors and back again with the reliability of a cosmic clock. The water carries with it not just salt and sediment, but the dissolved chemistry of an entire world, minerals leached from volcanic islands, organic compounds forming in the interface between sea and stone, the raw materials of life itself cycling through patterns as regular as breathing. Marine organisms, still simple chains of cells and primitive colonies, begin to synchronize their activities with these massive tidal rhythms. Reproduction happens at high tide when nutrients are most abundant. Feeding occurs in the rich tidal pools left behind by the receding waters. Rest comes during the slack periods between tidal extremes, when the waters pause in their eternal dance and something approaching stillness settles over the flooded plains. These earliest life forms develop internal clocks calibrated to the dual rhythms of tide and day, creating biological timekeeping systems that will persist across billions of years of evolution. The tidal zones themselves become laboratories of rhythm and rest. In pools that fill and empty with predictable regularity, microorganisms experiment with the first circadian cycles. Some species become most active during the brief periods of high tide abundance. Others retreat into dormancy during the chaotic churning, emerging only when the waters calm enough for delicate cellular processes to proceed without disruption. The boundary between activity and rest begins to map itself onto the boundaries between high and low water, creating the earliest connection between environmental cycles and biological sleep. Scientists studying these ancient tidal patterns discover that the rhythm of surge and retreat varies subtly with the seasons, creating longer cycles embedded within the daily patterns. During certain times of year, when orbital mechanics align the gravitational pulls of moon and sun, the tides reach extraordinary heights, flooding regions that remain dry for months at a time. These supertides carry with them exotic minerals from the deepest ocean basins, distributing rare elements across the tidal zones in patterns that modern geologists can still trace in billion-year-old rock formations. The mystery of how these early rhythms translated into the complex sleep cycles of modern organisms remains partially unsolved. Researchers find molecular clocks in the simplest bacteria that still respond to tidal frequencies, even in laboratory cultures that have never experienced ocean water. Some evolutionary biologists theorize that the fundamental period of REM sleep, roughly 90 minutes in humans, preserves an echo of these ancient tidal intervals, when the incoming and outgoing surges created natural periods of high activity followed by deeper rest. Only took 4 billion years for the moon to drift away far enough that tides became gentle. Only required the patience of gravity itself, gradually releasing its grip as orbital mechanics carried the lunar companion into higher, more distant paths. Only needed the kind of slow cosmic adjustment that makes even geological time seem hurried by comparison. The ancient shorelines remember these powerful rhythms in their fossilized ripple marks, wave patterns frozen in stone that speak of waters moving with forces no modern ocean has ever known. The chemical signatures of these primordial tides persist in the oldest sedimentary rocks, preserved in layers that alternate between deep ocean and shallow sea compositions. Geologists can read the ancient tidal tables written in these stone archives, determining not just the strength of prehistoric surges, but their exact timing, their seasonal variations, their gradual weakening as the moon spiraled outward through the gravitational dynamics of celestial mechanics. Each layer records a single tide cycle, creating chronometers of stone that measure time in the rise and fall of waters that covered a young world. In the deepest tidal pools, where the waters lingered longest between the great surges, the first complex molecules began their experiments with self-replication. The regular cycles of wetting and drying concentrated organic compounds, creating conditions where simple chemistry could take the first tentative steps toward life. The rhythm of abundance and scarcity, of submersion and exposure, provided the environmental pressure that selected for molecules capable of preserving themselves through cycles of change. These tidal laboratories operated on schedules more precise than any modern timepiece. The gravitational forces that drove them responded to celestial mechanics with mathematical perfection, creating patterns so regular that early life could calibrate its most fundamental processes against them. The twice-daily cycle became embedded in cellular machinery so deeply that even today, billions of years later, organisms removed from any environmental cues still maintain approximate 12-hour rhythms in their metabolic activity. The ancient tidal zones stretched across continents in broad bands where the water advanced and retreated like slow-motion tsunamis. In these vast shallow seas, the interplay of current and stillness created the first ecological niches based purely on timing. Species that could remain active during the turbulent surge phases occupied different spaces than those that required the calm periods for their life processes. The rhythm of the world began to sort life into temporal territories as much as spatial ones. Modern sleep researchers studying circadian biology sometimes observe that human rest patterns show subtle variations that align with tidal schedules, even in subjects living far from any ocean. The connection appears strongest during the new and full moons, when tidal forces reach their monthly peaks and some ancient cellular memory seems to stir in response. These tidal traces in human sleep architecture suggest that the moon's influence on rest and waking extends far deeper into evolutionary history than the obvious effects of light and darkness. The great tides carved temporary rivers that existed only during the hours of peak surge, channels that filled with rushing seawater twice each day and lay empty and silent between the flows. These ephemeral waterways created their own ecology of intermittent life. Species adapted to the rhythm of presence and absence, activity and dormancy. The pattern repeats across the planet's surface like a vast, slow heartbeat, the pulse of a world learning the first lessons of cyclical time. In the Archean atmosphere of 3 billion years ago, methane molecules drift through air so thick with organic haze that the concept of brightness has not yet been invented. The sun burns with youthful intensity in the sky above, but its light struggles through layers of hydrocarbon fog so dense that the surface of the Earth exists in perpetual twilight. This is a world without harsh transitions, without the sharp boundaries between day and night that will later drive the evolution of complex circadian systems. Instead, the planet bathes in a soft, amber glow that changes only subtly as the sun traces its path through the obscured heavens. The methane haze creates a kind of atmospheric cocoon, filtering solar radiation through organic molecules that scatter light in every direction. High above the surface, methane reacts with ultraviolet rays to form complex carbon chains that drift downward like molecular snow, adding layers of organic material to the primordial soup below. This constant rain of carbon compounds creates the building blocks for life in concentrations that modern Earth could never sustain, turning the entire atmosphere into a vast chemical laboratory where the ingredients of biology mix in slow-motion suspension. Temperatures remain remarkably stable in this shrouded world. The greenhouse effect of methane traps solar energy so efficiently that the planet's surface experiences neither the searing heat of direct sunlight nor the deep cold that would come with complete darkness. Instead, conditions hover in a narrow band that allows liquid water to exist in vast quantities while maintaining the chemical stability needed for the first experiments in self-replicating molecules. The atmospheric blanket acts like a planetary thermostat, maintaining conditions suitable for the earliest forms of life across enormous spans of geological time. Early microorganisms evolve in this gentle twilight without ever developing strong responses to light intensity. Their metabolic processes depend instead on chemical gradients, temperature variations, and the subtle tidal rhythms that still pulse through the shallow seas. These primitive life forms know rest and activity in patterns completely foreign to modern biology, dormancy cycles, based on nutrient availability rather than illumination. Cellular quiescence, triggered by molecular concentrations, rather than the position of invisible stars. The atmospheric chemistry creates its own cycles as methane concentrations rise and fall with the seasons. Volcanic activity pumps fresh hydrocarbons into the air while atmospheric reactions slowly consume them, creating fluctuations in the density of the organic haze. During periods of high methane concentration, the world grows dimmer and more muffled, sound traveling differently through air thick with carbon compounds. When volcanic inputs decrease, the atmosphere gradually clears until something approaching direct sunlight filters through to the surface before the next burst of geological activity renews the hazy veil. Scientists studying atmospheric models of this period discover that the methane haze would have created phenomena completely unknown to modern Earth. Light scattered through organic particles produces colors that have no names in contemporary language shades of amber and orange that exist in the spectrum between yellow and red, but possess qualities that pure mineral atmospheres cannot replicate. The sky itself becomes a kind of stained glass window, filtering and transforming solar radiation into wavelengths that modern plants could never photosynthesize, but which provided perfect conditions for the chemical processes that preceded photosynthesis. The mystery of how life transitioned from this gentle, chemical-driven world to the harsh light and dark cycles of oxygen-rich atmospheres remains one of the great puzzles of evolutionary biology. Researchers find metabolic pathways in modern bacteria that seem calibrated for atmospheric conditions that no longer exist, as if cellular machinery still carries molecular memories of air, thick with organic compounds, and light filtered through hydrocarbon veils. Only took 2 billion years for oxygen to clear away this atmospheric softness. Only required the patience of photosynthetic organisms gradually poisoning their own gentle world with the harsh reactivity of free oxygen. Only needed the kind of slow atmospheric revolution that makes even climate change seem sudden by comparison. The transition happened grain by grain, molecule by molecule, as biological processes learned to split water and release the gas that would eventually strip away the methane haze and expose the Earth to the full intensity of stellar radiation. The geological record preserves traces of this gradual brightening in rock formations that show increasing evidence of light-dependent processes. Stromatolites' layered structures built by ancient bacterial mats develop more complex patterns as the atmosphere clears, their builders responding to increasingly distinct day-night cycles. The rocks themselves change color as iron compounds oxidize in the growing oxygen concentration, painting the geological record with rust-red bands that mark the transition from the gentle amber world to the harsh blue-white reality of modern skies. In the deepest ocean basins, pockets of the ancient atmosphere persist for millions of years after the surface transitions to oxygen dominance. These submarine refugia maintain the old methane-rich chemistry, supporting communities of organisms that evolved in the gentle twilight world and cannot survive the oxidizing conditions of the new atmosphere. Deep-sea hydrothermal vents continue to produce the hydrocarbon chemistry of the Archean world, creating time capsules where life forms practice the metabolic arts of an Earth that no longer exists at the surface. The atmospheric pressure during this period reaches levels unknown to modern Earth. The dense methane atmosphere weighs heavily on the surface, creating pressure conditions that affect everything from the boiling point of water to the behavior of dissolved gases in the primordial oceans. Sound travels faster and farther through the thick air, creating acoustic environments where vibrations can cross continents without significant attenuation. The world itself resonates more deeply, its geological processes generating harmonics that propagate through atmospheric media capable of carrying frequencies across planetary distances. Modern atmospheric chemists recreating these conditions in laboratory settings discover that methane-rich air has remarkable properties for preserving complex organic molecules. Compounds that would decompose rapidly in oxygen-rich environments remain stable for geological periods when surrounded by the reducing chemistry of hydrocarbon atmospheres. This atmospheric preservation may have provided the extended time periods needed for the first self-replicating systems to emerge from random chemical interactions, giving molecular evolution the luxury of eons to experiment with increasingly complex arrangements. The transition from methane haze to oxygen clarity represents one of the most dramatic environmental shifts in planetary history. Yet, it occurred so gradually that individual organisms could adapt through normal evolutionary processes rather than mass extinction events. The atmospheric change created new ecological niches faster than it destroyed old ones, allowing the biosphere to maintain continuity even as it fundamentally transformed the chemical basis of life on Earth. The gentle amber world gave way to harsh blue skies so slowly that the planet itself never noticed the moment when twilight finally ended and the modern era of bright days and dark nights began. 2.5 billion years ago, in the molten core of the young Earth, convection currents begin to organize themselves into patterns that will persist across geological ages. Liquid iron moves in vast spirals through the planet's interior, driven by temperature differences and the steady rotation of the world above. These churning metal currents create the first stirrings of Earth's magnetic field, invisible lines of force that reach far into space and wrap the planet in a protective electromagnetic cocoon that will make all future life possible. The magnetic field emerges gradually from the chaos of the cooling core, strengthening as the convection patterns become more stable and organized. In the beginning, the field fluctuates wildly, sometimes reversing its polarity completely, leaving the planet temporarily exposed to the full intensity of solar radiation and cosmic particles. But as the core solidifies into its modern structure, liquid outer shell surrounding a solid iron center, the magnetic dynamo settles into more reliable rhythms, generating a shield that deflects most harmful radiation away from the surface and into the vacuum of space. This electromagnetic envelope creates the first truly stable environment for biological processes to develop without constant disruption from cosmic interference. Solar wind, which could strip away atmospheric gases and sterilize the surface with high-energy particles, instead flows around the magnetic boundaries like water around a stone. The interaction between solar plasma and magnetic field lines creates the magnetosphere, a vast, invisible bubble that extends far beyond the Moon's orbit and shapes the space environment around Earth in ways that affect everything from atmospheric retention to the formation of the aurora. Within this protective field, subtle electromagnetic patterns develop that will eventually influence the evolution of life itself. The magnetic field varies slightly with geographic location, creating gradients and anomalies that some organisms learn to navigate by. These variations pulse with the planet's rotation, generating low-frequency electromagnetic rhythms that cycle with the day-night pattern. Early life forms, swimming in oceans filled with dissolved iron and other magnetic minerals, begin to sense and respond to these invisible currents in ways that modern biology is only beginning to understand. The interaction between the magnetic field and the planet's rotation creates patterns of electromagnetic activity that repeat on multiple time scales. Daily fluctuations follow the spinning of the world, while longer cycles correspond to changes in the core's convection patterns and the gradual drift of magnetic north. These electromagnetic rhythms provide some of the earliest environmental cues that remain constant across geological time-invisible metronomes that tick with the deep mechanical processes of planetary rotation and internal heat flow. Scientists studying the ancient magnetic field discover that its strength has varied dramatically throughout Earth's history. During periods of low magnetic intensity, increased cosmic radiation reaches the surface, creating evolutionary pressures that may have accelerated the development of cellular repair mechanisms. When the field strengthens, the gentler electromagnetic environment allows for more delicate biological processes to emerge, perhaps including the subtle electrical activities that eventually develop into neural networks and, much later, the complex electromagnetic patterns of dreaming brains. The mystery of how organisms first began to sense magnetic fields remains largely unsolved. Researchers find microscopic crystals of magnetite in bacteria that are billions of years old, suggesting that magnetic sensitivity evolved very early in the history of life. These cellular compass needles allow even simple organisms to orient themselves relative to the planet's magnetic geometry, creating the first biological navigation systems that operate independently of light, gravity, or chemical gradients. Only took 1 billion years for the magnetic dynamo to stabilize into its modern configuration. Only required the patience of liquid iron slowly organizing itself into convection cells large enough to span continents. Only needed the kind of deep planetary circulation that makes even ocean currents seem ephemeral by comparison. The magnetic field continues to evolve today, its north pole wandering across the Arctic at speeds that suggest another reversal may occur within thousands rather than millions of years. The electromagnetic patterns generated by the magnetosphere create standing wave structures in the space around Earth that pulse with frequencies similar to those found in biological systems. These magnetospheric rhythms fluctuate in the extremely low frequency range that corresponds to brainwave patterns, particularly the slow oscillations associated with deep sleep. Some researchers theorize that biological electromagnetic sensitivity evolved partly in response to these planetary field patterns, creating neural architectures that naturally resonate with the Earth's own electromagnetic breathing. Modern studies of the magnetosphere reveal that it breathes in a regular pattern, expanding and contracting as solar wind pressure varies throughout the day and across the solar cycle. During periods of low solar activity, the magnetic boundary extends farther into space, creating a more spacious electromagnetic environment around the planet. When solar storms compress the magnetosphere, the entire system responds like a struck bell, ringing with frequencies that propagate through the upper atmosphere and may affect biological processes on the surface below. The magnetic field lines themselves create invisible architecture in the space around Earth, forming curved pathways that guide charged particles in complex spirals between the magnetic poles. These field line geometries create natural focusing effects that concentrate certain types of electromagnetic activity in specific geographic regions. The aurora zones, where magnetic field lines funnel solar particles into the upper atmosphere, become natural laboratories where electromagnetic energy transforms into visible light through interactions with atmospheric gases. In the ancient oceans, dissolved iron particles align themselves with the magnetic field lines, creating microscopic patterns that some early organisms learned to read like a compass. These magnetic minerals precipitation from seawater in orientations that preserve the direction and intensity of the ancient magnetic field, creating geological records that modern scientists can decipher to reconstruct the electromagnetic history of the planet. The ocean floors become vast libraries of magnetic information, with each layer of sediment recording the field configuration at the time it settled to the bottom. The deep-sea magnetic patterns reveal that Earth's magnetic field has reversed its polarity hundreds of times throughout geological history, sometimes remaining in a reverse state for millions of years before flipping back. During these reversal periods, the field strength drops dramatically, and the planet experiences increased cosmic radiation that creates additional mutations in evolving organisms. These electromagnetic upheavals may have provided some of the evolutionary pressure that drove the development of increasingly sophisticated cellular repair mechanisms, and eventually, the complex error-checking systems that protect genetic information in higher organisms. The magnetosphere creates its own weather patterns as it interacts with the variable solar wind. Magnetic substorms develop when solar particles temporarily overwhelm the field's protective capacity, creating electromagnetic disturbances that ripple through the entire system. These magnetic weather events follow predictable patterns related to solar activity cycles, creating another layer of environmental rhythm that organisms can potentially sense and respond to through their evolved electromagnetic sensitivities. In the primordial seas of 3.5 billion years ago, calcium ions drift through water that contains concentrations of minerals unlike anything in the modern oceans. These simple charged particles, dissolved from volcanic rocks and carried by ancient rivers, begin to play roles in cellular processes that will persist across every subsequent stage of evolutionary history. The earliest organisms discover that calcium can serve as a molecular messenger, carrying information across cell membranes and triggering responses that allow single-celled life to react to changes in its environment with something approaching intention. The calcium signaling systems that develop in these primitive cells operate through mechanisms so fundamental that they will be preserved in every form of life that follows. When calcium concentrations rise inside a cell, specific proteins change their shape in response, creating cascades of molecular activity that can alter everything from metabolic rate to membrane permeability. These calcium-triggered responses represent some of the first examples of biological information processing simple chemical signals that allow cells to communicate internally and coordinate their activities with the rhythms of the external world. The ancient oceans provide ideal conditions for calcium-based signaling to evolve. Volcanic activity continuously adds calcium to the water, while biological processes and chemical precipitation remove it, creating natural fluctuations in concentration that early organisms can exploit as environmental cues. Tidal mixing brings calcium-rich deep water to the surface on predictable schedules, while seasonal variations in river flow create longer-term cycles in mineral availability. Cells that can sense and respond to these calcium rhythms gain significant advantages in timing their reproduction, metabolism, and dormancy phases. Modern neuroscientists studying calcium signaling discover that virtually every aspect of brain function depends on these ancient molecular mechanisms. The electrical activity that characterizes neural networks relies on calcium ions flowing across cell membranes in precisely controlled patterns. During sleep, calcium signaling helps regulate the production of neurotransmitters that maintain rest states, while calcium-dependent processes in the brain clear metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. The molecular machinery of dreams operates through calcium cascades that echo the signaling systems first developed in prehistoric seas. The evolutionary connection between calcium signaling and circadian rhythms runs remarkably deep. In organisms as simple as bacteria, calcium concentrations inside cells fluctuate with daily patterns that persist even when environmental cues like light and temperature remain constant. These internal calcium clocks help coordinate cellular activities with the external rhythms of the world, creating some of the first biological timekeeping mechanisms that operate independently of immediate environmental conditions. Scientists examining the fossil record find evidence that calcium-based biological processes have remained essentially unchanged for billions of years. Stromatolites-layered rock structures built by ancient bacterial communities show calcium deposition patterns that suggest their builders used calcium signaling to coordinate their collective activities. The timing of calcium precipitation in these ancient reefs follows cycles that match modern circadian rhythms, indicating that the molecular basis of biological timekeeping established itself very early in the history of life on Earth. The mystery of how calcium signaling first evolved from simple chemical reactions into complex information processing systems continues to puzzle researchers. Laboratory experiments recreating ancient ocean chemistry show that calcium ions naturally concentrate in lipid membrane structures under conditions similar to those in primordial seas. This spontaneous organization may have provided the foundation for cells to develop more sophisticated calcium handling mechanisms through gradual evolutionary refinement. Only took 2 billion years for calcium signaling to develop from simple ion movement into the complex neural networks that generate conscious thought. Only required the patience of molecular evolution, testing countless variations of protein structure until calcium binding sites achieved the precision needed for reliable information processing. Only needed the kind of incremental refinement that makes even genetic mutation seem rapid by comparison. The calcium channels in modern neurons still operate using protein structures that preserve the basic architecture developed in ancient seas. The calcium chemistry of the primordial oceans created conditions unlike any modern marine environment. Higher temperatures and different atmospheric composition allowed calcium to exist in solution at concentrations that would cause massive precipitation in contemporary seawater. These calcium-rich conditions provided abundant raw material for early organisms to experiment with calcium-based processes, leading to the development of calcium-storing organelles, calcium-sensitive proteins, and calcium-dependent membrane systems that form the foundation of all modern cellular signaling. The relationship between calcium availability and biological activity creates some of the earliest examples of environmental feedback loops in living systems. When organisms use calcium for shell building or metabolic processes, they reduce the concentration of available calcium in their immediate environment. This depletion creates selection pressure for more efficient calcium utilization, leading to increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for calcium capture, storage, and recycling that persist in modern physiology. Deep ocean vents continue to provide insights into how calcium signaling might have evolved in the planet's earliest environments. The extreme temperatures and mineral concentrations around these underwater volcanic sites create chemistry similar to ancient ocean conditions, supporting communities of organisms that rely heavily on calcium-based metabolic processes. These vent communities may preserve metabolic strategies that developed when the entire ocean resembled a vast hydrothermal system. The isotopic signatures of calcium in ancient rock formations reveal that biological calcium processing has significantly altered the planet's calcium cycle over geological time. Early organisms extracted so much calcium from seawater for their cellular processes that they shifted the chemical balance of the entire ocean system. This biological influence on global calcium distribution represents one of the first examples of life-altering planetary chemistry on a scale large enough to affect geological processes. Modern sleep research reveals that calcium signaling plays crucial roles in the consolidation of memories during rest periods. The same molecular mechanisms that allow cells to respond to environmental calcium fluctuations also enable neurons to strengthen synaptic connections based on patterns of electrical activity during sleep. This connection between calcium chemistry and memory formation suggests that the capacity for learning and the capacity for rest may have evolved together as complementary aspects of calcium-dependent information processing. The calcium-handling proteins found in modern cells show clear evolutionary relationships to similar proteins in the most ancient bacterial lineages, indicating that the basic toolkit for calcium signaling developed very early and has been conserved across billions of years of evolution. These molecular fossils provide a direct biochemical link between the simplest forms of life and the complex neural activities that characterize consciousness and dreams in higher organisms. Beneath the surface of the ancient Earth, water begins its slow migration through networks of microscopic cracks and porous rock layers, establishing circulation patterns that will persist for millions of years without ever seeing sunlight. These underground rivers move at speeds measured in centimeters per century, carrying dissolved minerals through pathways that extend for thousands of kilometers beneath continents. The water that enters these subterranean systems during one geological epoch may not emerge at springs or wells until entire mountain ranges have risen and eroded away above it. The formation of these deep aquifers requires conditions of extraordinary geological patience. Rainwater seeps downward through soil and fractured bedrock, following the pull of gravity through increasingly narrow passages until it reaches layers of rock so dense and impermeable that further descent becomes impossible. Here, trapped between geological formations, water accumulates in vast underground lakes and slow-moving streams that exist in complete darkness. Their boundaries defined not by shores, but by the subtle variations in rock, porosity, and permeability that determine where liquid can flow and where it cannot. These hidden water systems develop their own complex geography, with underground watersheds that often bear no relationship to the surface drainage patterns above them. Subterranean rivers may flow in directions opposite to the streams overhead, carrying water from desert regions toward distant mountain ranges through rock conduits that formed millions of years earlier when the continents occupied different positions. The underground water moves through three-dimensional networks of connected pore spaces, creating fluid architectures that exist independently of surface topography. The chemistry of groundwater changes slowly as it migrates through different rock types, dissolving minerals in concentrations that reflect the geological history of its underground journey. Water that began its subterranean travel as pure rainfall gradually accumulates dissolved salts, metals, and rare earth elements that tell the story of every rock formation it has encountered. By the time this ancient water reaches the deepest aquifers, it may contain mineral concentrations unlike any surface water, having spent millennia extracting the chemical essence of the continental crust through which it moves. Modern hydrologists studying these deep water systems discover circulation patterns that operate on timescales longer than human civilization. Water entering the deepest aquifers today may not return to the surface for tens of thousands of years, creating underground reservoirs that preserve samples of ancient climate conditions in their chemical composition. During ice ages, the isotopic signature of precipitation changes in ways that remain detectable in groundwater long after surface conditions have returned to normal, making deep aquifers into archives of paleoclimatic information. The pressure conditions in deep groundwater systems create environments where water behaves in ways impossible at the surface. At depths of several kilometers, the weight of overlying rock compresses water into states of density and molecular organization not found in surface environments. This compressed water can dissolve minerals that would remain inert in normal surface chemistry, creating unique chemical environments where rare geological processes occur over extended periods. Scientists examining the microbiology of deep aquifers find organisms that have been isolated from surface environments for millions of years, evolving in complete independence from the familiar ecosystems above. These subterranean communities derive their energy entirely from chemical reactions with dissolved minerals, creating biological processes that operate without any input from solar energy. The metabolism of these deep organisms proceeds at rates so slow that individual cells may remain active for thousands of years, maintaining life processes through strategies completely foreign to surface biology. The mystery of how water first established these deep circulation patterns involves complex interactions between tectonic forces, climate variations, and the gradual cooling of the planet's crust. As surface temperatures stabilized and continents achieved their current configurations, water infiltration and circulation had to adjust to new geological realities, creating the modern patterns of groundwater flow through processes that required millions of years to reach equilibrium. Only took 10 million years for the deepest aquifers to establish their current circulation patterns. Only required the patience of water slowly learning the geometry of continental-scale rock formations. Only needed the kind of hydraulic persistence that makes even river systems seem ephemeral by comparison. The water continues its underground migration today, following pathways established when the surface world bore no resemblance to modern landscapes. The temperature of deep groundwater reflects the geothermal conditions at the depths where it circulates, creating underground thermal environments that remain constant while surface temperatures fluctuate with seasons and climate changes. In some regions, groundwater emerges at hot springs whose temperatures have remained stable for thousands of years, providing windows into the thermal conditions that exist in the planet's subsurface. These consistent temperatures create underground environments where biological and chemical processes can proceed without the temperature variations that characterize surface conditions. The interaction between groundwater and rock creates slow chemical weathering processes that gradually alter the mineral composition of both the water and the surrounding stone. Over millions of years, these chemical reactions can dissolve entire limestone formations, creating underground caverns and cave systems that provide additional pathways for water circulation. The dissolution processes operate so slowly that individual cave chambers may take hundreds of thousands of years to reach their final dimensions. Deep groundwater systems serve as massive underground batteries, storing and releasing water on geological timescales that help stabilize surface water supplies across long-term climate variations. During periods of abundant precipitation, excess water infiltrates into deep aquifers where it remains available during subsequent dry periods that may last for decades or centuries. This underground water storage creates natural climate buffering that operates independently of human management, providing long-term hydrological stability that supports both surface ecosystems and deep subsurface communities. The dissolved gas content of deep groundwater preserves atmospheric samples from the time periods when the water first infiltrated below ground. Ancient air bubbles trapped in groundwater can contain atmospheric compositions from thousands of years ago, including concentrations of gases that reflect past climate conditions. These dissolved atmosphere samples make deep aquifers into repositories of paleoclimatic data that complement the information preserved in ice cores and sedimentary rocks. The hydraulic properties of deep aquifer systems create natural pressure variations that pulse with the tidal forces affecting the solid Earth. Even at depths of several kilometers, groundwater levels fluctuate slightly with the twice-daily tidal bulge that deforms the planet's crust. These tiny pressure variations can trigger the release of dissolved gases from groundwater, creating subtle chemical cycles that repeat with tidal periodicity in environments that never experience direct tidal effects. Modern water resource management increasingly relies on understanding these deep groundwater systems as sources of water that operate independently of surface precipitation patterns. The water stored in deep aquifers represents reserves that accumulated over geological time periods, making them non-renewable on human timescales, but invaluable as buffers against short-term climate variations and drought conditions that affect surface water supplies. In the ancient seas of 2 billion years ago, the first primitive organisms begin to develop clusters of light-sensitive proteins that can detect the difference between the filtered illumination of day and the deeper darkness that comes with night. These earliest photoreceptors consist of nothing more than a few molecules capable of changing shape when struck by photons, but they represent the first biological experiments with vision, the tentative beginning of a sensory capacity that will eventually lead to the complex neural processing of sight and, much later, the phenomenon of closing eyes in sleep. The evolution of light sensitivity emerges gradually from chemical processes that initially serve entirely different purposes. Many of the proteins that will eventually become photoreceptors begin as simple molecular machines for capturing energy from sunlight, converting photons into chemical bonds that cells can use for metabolism. But as these light harvesting systems become more sophisticated, some organisms discover that the same molecular machinery can provide information about environmental light levels, creating the first crude distinction between illuminated and dark conditions. These primitive light sensors offer no capacity for forming images or detecting movement. They respond only to changes in overall illumination intensity. Yet even this simple binary information provides significant survival advantages in a world where light levels change predictably with the daily rotation of the planet. Organisms that can anticipate the transition from day to night gain opportunities to time their metabolic activities, reproductive cycles, and periods of reduced activity to coincide with optimal environmental conditions. The earliest forms of rest behavior appear to evolve alongside these primitive light-sensing capabilities. Organisms that detect decreasing light levels begin to modify their activity patterns in response, reducing energy expenditure during dark periods when photosynthesis becomes impossible and visual navigation fails. These behavioral changes represent the first tentative steps toward what might be recognized as sleep-like states, periods of reduced activity that serve to conserve energy and synchronize biological processes with environmental rhythms. Modern researchers studying the evolution of photoreceptors discover that the basic molecular architecture of light-sensitive proteins has remained remarkably consistent across billions of years of evolution. The same fundamental chemical mechanisms that allow simple bacteria to detect light intensity continue to operate in the complex visual systems of higher organisms. Even the molecular cascades that translate photon absorption into cellular responses show clear evolutionary relationships between the simplest bacterial photoreceptors and the sophisticated neural processing that occurs in mammalian visual cortex. The transition from simple light detection to true vision requires the development of spatial organization in photoreceptor arrays. Early organisms begin to cluster their light-sensitive proteins into concentrated patches on their cell surfaces, creating primitive eye spots that can detect not only light intensity but also the direction from which illumination arrives. These eye spots allow organisms to orient themselves relative to light sources and begin the evolutionary journey toward image formation and visual navigation. The mystery of how organisms first began to coordinate their light-sensing capabilities with behavioral responses involves complex interactions between photoreceptor proteins and the cellular machinery that controls movement and metabolism. Laboratory studies of modern bacteria reveal light response pathways that operate through the same calcium signaling systems that evolved earlier for general cellular communication, suggesting that light-sensing abilities were integrated into existing regulatory networks rather than evolving as entirely separate systems. Only took 500 million years for simple light detection to evolve into complex eyes capable of image formation. Only required the patience of countless organisms experimenting with different arrangements of photoreceptive cells. Only needed the kind of gradual refinement that makes even genetic evolution seem rapid by comparison. The eyes that eventually develop still rely on the same fundamental light-sensing proteins that first appeared in ancient bacterial membranes. The relationship between light detection and rest behaviors creates some of the first examples of predictive biology organisms that modify their current activities based on anticipated future environmental conditions. As light sensing capabilities improve, organisms become able to detect the subtle changes in illumination that precede sunrise and sunset, allowing them to begin preparing for transitions between day and night activity patterns before the environmental changes become dramatic. The evolutionary pressure to develop more sensitive light detection drives the gradual improvement of photoreceptor systems across millions of generations. Organisms with even slight advantages in light sensitivity gain significant benefits in environments where the difference between detecting approaching dawn a few minutes earlier or later can determine access to food resources, mating opportunities, or predator avoidance. This selection pressure leads to increasingly sophisticated arrangements of photoreceptor cells and the neural processing systems needed to interpret their signals. The chemical basis of photoreception relies on molecules that can exist in two different structural configurations, switching between them when they absorb photons of appropriate wavelengths. This photoisomerization process creates the molecular foundation for all subsequent evolution of visual systems, establishing the basic mechanism by which light energy becomes converted into biological information. The same chemical principles that govern simple bacterial photoreception continue to operate in the rhodopsin molecules that enable human vision. Early photoreceptor systems show clear relationships to the circadian clock mechanisms that regulate daily activity cycles in modern organisms. Many of the proteins involved in light detection also participate in the molecular machinery that tracks daily time, suggesting that light sensing abilities and circadian timing evolve together as complementary aspects of temporal organization in living systems. This integration creates biological clocks that can be reset by light exposure, maintaining synchronization with environmental day-night cycles. The development of light-sensitive eye spots represents one of the first examples of sensory organ specialized cellular structures dedicated entirely to gathering information about environmental conditions. Unlike metabolic or reproductive systems that serve obvious survival functions, sensory organs exist purely to collect and process information, marking a significant transition toward organisms that actively monitor their environment rather than simply responding to immediate chemical or physical conditions. The geographical distribution of early light-sensitive organisms reveals that photoreception evolved independently multiple times in different lineages, suggesting that the benefits of light detection created strong evolutionary pressure across diverse biological environments. This convergent evolution produces remarkably similar photoreceptor systems in organisms that share no recent common ancestry, indicating that the physics and chemistry of light detection constrains biological solutions within relatively narrow ranges of molecular possibilities. The first behavioral responses to light detection involve simple changes in movement patterns, organisms moving toward or away from light sources, depending on their particular metabolic needs and survival strategies. These phototactic behaviors represent the earliest examples of sensory-guided navigation, establishing the foundation for all subsequent evolution of complex behaviors based on environmental information gathering rather than immediate chemical responses to local conditions. The slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, established 23 degrees from vertical by the ancient collision that formed the Moon, creates the first seasonal variations as the planet orbits its star. This axial tilt means that different regions of the world receive varying amounts of solar energy throughout the year, establishing patterns of temperature and daylight duration that repeat with mathematical precision every 365 days. The seasonal cycle becomes one of the most reliable environmental rhythms available to evolving life, providing predictable variations that organisms can anticipate and prepare for through behavioral and physiological adaptations. In the high latitudes, where seasonal effects reach their most extreme expressions, the difference between summer and winter daylight creates environments that shift between months of continuous illumination and months of near total darkness. These dramatic seasonal light cycles drive the evolution of biological strategies unlike anything found in more stable tropical environments. Organisms living in these seasonally variable regions must develop mechanisms for surviving extended periods when normal metabolic activities become impossible or energetically wasteful. The earliest forms of seasonal dormancy appear in organisms that inhabit shallow water bodies that freeze during winter months. As temperatures drop and ice begins to form at the surface, these primitive life forms reduce their metabolic rates to levels barely sufficient to maintain cellular integrity. This seasonal torpor allows organisms to survive conditions that would otherwise be lethal, creating survival strategies that depend on temporarily suspending most life processes until favorable conditions return with the changing seasons. The biochemical mechanisms that enable seasonal dormancy involve complex changes in cellular chemistry that prepare organisms for extended periods of reduced activity. Cells begin producing specialized proteins that protect cellular structures from damage during prolonged cold exposure, while metabolic pathways shift toward the breakdown of stored energy reserves rather than active food gathering and processing. These physiological preparations for dormancy represent some of the earliest examples of predictive biological responses organisms modifying their internal chemistry in anticipation of future environmental conditions. Modern chronobiologists studying seasonal rhythms discover that many organisms possess internal calendar systems that track the passage of time across multiple annual cycles. These biological calendars operate through molecular mechanisms that can measure the gradual changes in daylight duration that occur as seasons progress, allowing organisms to anticipate seasonal transitions weeks or months before they occur. The molecular basis of seasonal timekeeping involves the same clock proteins that regulate daily circadian rhythms, but organized into longer-term timing circuits that track annual rather than daily environmental cycles. The relationship between seasonal dormancy and the later evolution of sleep remains an active area of research. Many of the physiological changes that occur during seasonal hibernation: reduced metabolic rate, altered brain activity, cessation of normal behavioral responses closely resemble the changes that occur during daily sleep cycles in higher organisms. This suggests that seasonal dormancy may have provided the evolutionary foundation for the development of shorter-term rest periods that eventually became daily sleep patterns. Scientists examining the fossil record find evidence that seasonal behavioral patterns established themselves very early in the evolution of multicellular life. Ancient coral reefs show growth patterns that clearly reflect seasonal variations in water temperature and nutrient availability, indicating that even simple colonial organisms developed seasonal rhythms in their biological activities. These fossilized growth bands provide direct evidence that seasonal timing has influenced biological processes for hundreds of millions of years. The mystery of how organisms first began to measure seasonal time involves complex interactions between light-sensing systems and the molecular clocks that track daily rhythms. Research on modern plants reveals that seasonal timing depends on comparing the length of daily light and dark periods to internal expectations based on circadian clock function. This photoperiodic time measurement allows organisms to determine both the current season and the direction of seasonal change, providing information needed for appropriate timing of dormancy, reproduction, and other seasonal behaviors. Only took 50 million years for seasonal dormancy to evolve into the complex hibernation strategies used by modern mammals. Only required the patience of countless generations, gradually extending their periods of reduced activity until entire seasons could be spent in suspended animation. Only needed the kind of physiological refinement that makes even developmental biology seem rushed by comparison. The hibernation patterns that develop still depend on seasonal cues first established by the planet's axial tilt billions of years ago. The geographic distribution of seasonal dormancy strategies reveals clear relationships to latitude and climate patterns. Organisms living closest to the poles, where seasonal variations reach their most extreme expressions, develop the most dramatic dormancy responses, capable of surviving months of continuous darkness and temperatures far below freezing. Species living in more moderate latitudes develop intermediate dormancy strategies, while tropical organisms that experience minimal seasonal variation often lack seasonal dormancy capabilities entirely. The energy storage systems that support seasonal dormancy require months of preparation during the favorable seasons preceding dormancy periods. Organisms must accumulate fat reserves, specialized proteins, and other biochemical resources sufficient to maintain vital functions throughout extended periods when normal feeding and energy acquisition become impossible. These seasonal energy storage cycles create annual rhythms of accumulation and depletion that influence every aspect of organismal biology, from cellular metabolism to reproductive timing. The neural mechanisms that control seasonal dormancy involve brain regions specialized for monitoring environmental conditions and coordinating appropriate physiological responses. During dormancy periods, brain activity reduces to levels just sufficient to maintain essential functions like temperature regulation and the timing mechanisms needed to emerge from dormancy at appropriate seasonal moments. This selective reduction in neural activity represents an early example of the kind of differential brain state changes that will eventually characterize daily sleep cycles. The evolutionary advantages of seasonal dormancy become particularly apparent during periods of climatic instability, when seasonal patterns become more extreme or unpredictable. Organisms capable of entering dormancy can survive seasonal conditions that would eliminate species dependent on continuous metabolic activity throughout the year. This survival advantage helps explain why seasonal dormancy capabilities appear to evolve repeatedly in different lineages when environmental conditions favor such strategies. The molecular clocks that enable seasonal timing show remarkable precision in tracking annual cycles across multiple years. Laboratory studies reveal that organisms maintained in constant environmental conditions continue to exhibit seasonal rhythms for several years, indicating that seasonal timing systems can operate independently of immediate environmental cues. This autonomous seasonal timing capability allows organisms to maintain appropriate seasonal behaviors even when environmental conditions become temporarily unreliable due to weather variations or other disturbances. The relationship between seasonal dormancy and reproductive timing creates annual cycles where periods of reduced activity alternate with periods of intense biological activity focused on reproduction and offspring care. These seasonal reproductive strategies ensure that offspring are born during favorable seasons when food resources are most abundant and environmental conditions most suitable for growth and development. The coordination between dormancy timing and reproductive timing requires sophisticated biological calendar systems that can integrate multiple environmental cues across extended time periods. In the molecular machinery of ancient cells, nearly 3 billion years ago, a simple compound begins to appear that will eventually become one of the most important signaling molecules in biology. Melatonin synthesizes itself from amino acids already present in primitive organisms, initially serving as a basic antioxidant that protects cellular structures from damage caused by reactive oxygen species. This early protective function operates without any connection to light or darkness, simply providing chemical defense against the oxidative stress that accompanies basic metabolic processes in early life forms. The melatonin molecule itself possesses remarkable chemical stability, allowing it to persist in biological systems across evolutionary timescales that span billions of years. Its basic structure derived from the amino acid tryptophan through a series of enzymatic modifications proves so effective at neutralizing harmful free radicals that virtually every form of life that follows will retain the capacity to synthesize this ancient protective compound. The chemical pathway that produces melatonin becomes one of the most conserved biochemical processes in biology, appearing in organisms as diverse as bacteria, plants, and animals with virtually identical molecular mechanisms. As organisms develop more sophisticated light-sensing capabilities, melatonin production gradually becomes linked to environmental illumination patterns. The same cellular machinery that initially produced melatonin for general antioxidant protection begins to respond to light exposure, reducing melatonin synthesis during bright periods and increasing production during darkness. This light-dependent regulation transforms melatonin from a simple protective molecule into an internal chemical signal that tracks the daily light-dark cycle. The transition from constant melatonin production to light-regulated synthesis represents one of the earliest examples of environmental signal transduction in biology. Organisms that can modulate their internal chemistry in response to external light conditions gain significant advantages in coordinating their biological processes with the predictable daily rhythms of the planet. Melatonin becomes the molecular messenger that translates information about environmental light levels into appropriate cellular responses throughout the organism. Modern molecular biologists studying melatonin synthesis discover that the enzymatic pathways responsible for its production show clear evolutionary relationships across vastly different forms of life. The rate-limiting enzyme that controls melatonin synthesis, N-acetyltransferase, operates through nearly identical mechanisms in bacteria, plants, and mammals, indicating that this regulatory system established itself very early in evolutionary history and has been preserved across billions of years of subsequent biological diversification. The cellular targets of melatonin action include some of the most fundamental regulatory systems in biology. Melatonin interacts with cellular membranes, modifying their permeability and electrical properties in ways that affect the flow of ions across cellular boundaries. These membrane effects influence virtually every aspect of cellular function, from metabolic rate to the electrical activity that characterizes neural signaling. The molecular versatility of melatonin allows it to coordinate multiple cellular processes simultaneously, making it an ideal candidate for the role of master regulatory molecule. The relationship between melatonin and cellular energy production involves complex interactions with the mitochondrial systems that generate most cellular energy. Melatonin appears to optimize mitochondrial efficiency during dark periods, when many organisms reduce their overall activity levels and energy requirements. This metabolic optimization may have provided the evolutionary foundation for the energy conservation functions that melatonin serves in modern sleep systems, where it helps coordinate the reduction in energy expenditure that characterizes rest periods. Scientists examining the distribution of melatonin in different cellular compartments find that it accumulates in highest concentrations within cellular structures that are most vulnerable to oxidative damage. The nucleus, where genetic material requires protection from chemical damage, maintains particularly high melatonin levels during dark periods. Mitochondria, which generate reactive oxygen species as byproducts of energy production, also concentrate melatonin as protection against the oxidative stress they create through normal metabolic activity. The mystery of how melatonin synthesis first became coupled to light detection involves evolutionary changes in the regulatory regions of genes that control the enzymes responsible for melatonin production. Modern genetic analysis reveals that melatonin-synthesizing enzymes possess regulatory sequences that respond to the same transcriptional activators triggered by light-sensing systems, creating molecular links between environmental illumination and melatonin production that operate at the level of gene expression. Only took 1 billion years for melatonin to evolve from a simple antioxidant into the complex regulatory molecule that coordinates sleep and circadian rhythms in modern organisms. Only required the patience of molecular evolution, gradually linking ancient protective systems to environmental sensing mechanisms. Only needed the kind of biochemical refinement that makes even protein evolution seem hasty by comparison. The melatonin that regulates human sleep cycles operates through molecular pathways first established in organisms that lived before complex cells had even evolved. The seasonal variations in melatonin production that characterize modern organisms reflect the integration of daily light-dark cycles with longer-term seasonal patterns of daylight duration. As day length changes throughout the year, the duration of daily melatonin production shifts accordingly, creating internal chemical calendars that track seasonal time. These seasonal melatonin rhythms provide the biochemical foundation for seasonal behaviors like hibernation, migration, and reproductive timing that depend on accurate measurement of annual cycles. The interaction between melatonin and other signaling systems creates networks of molecular communication that coordinate multiple aspects of biological timing. Melatonin production influences the synthesis of other regulatory molecules, while responding to feedback from various cellular and organ systems that monitor the organism's physiological state. This biochemical integration allows melatonin to serve as a central coordinator of biological rhythms rather than simply marking the transition between light and dark periods. The cellular mechanisms through which melatonin exerts its effects involve binding to specific receptor proteins that translate melatonin concentration into appropriate cellular responses. These melatonin receptors appear in organisms across the entire spectrum of biological complexity, from simple bacteria to complex multicellular animals, indicating that receptor-mediated melatonin signaling represents another ancient and highly conserved aspect of biological regulation. Modern research into melatonin's protective functions reveals that its antioxidant capabilities extend far beyond simple free radical neutralization. Melatonin also stimulates the production of other antioxidant enzymes, creating cascades of protective activity that defend cells against multiple forms of chemical damage. This comprehensive protective action may explain why melatonin has been so strongly conserved throughout evolutionary history, serving essential protective functions that remain as important today as they were in the earliest forms of cellular life. The timing of melatonin synthesis relative to other circadian processes creates temporal organization within cells that coordinates the optimal timing of different biological activities. DNA repair processes, protein synthesis, and metabolic pathway regulation all show coordinated relationships with melatonin production cycles, suggesting that melatonin serves as a temporal organizing principle that helps cells schedule their various activities for appropriate times within the daily cycle. In the depths of ancient seas, where volcanic activity and chemical weathering combine to create mineral-rich waters, calcium carbonate begins to precipitate in patterns that will eventually become vast limestone formations. The process occurs molecule by molecule. As dissolved calcium ions encounter carbonate compounds and spontaneously crystallize into structures that capture the exact chemical conditions present at the moment of their formation. These early limestone deposits accumulate in layers that preserve detailed records of ocean chemistry, atmospheric composition, and biological activity across millions of years of Earth history. The formation of limestone caves represents one of the slowest architectural processes on the planet. Slightly acidic groundwater dissolves calcium carbonate grain by grain, creating underground voids that expand over thousands of years into chambers large enough to contain entire underground lakes and cathedral-sized spaces carved from solid rock. The dissolution process operates with such gradual precision that individual cave formations preserve the exact flow patterns of the ancient water that created them, frozen in stone geometries that record the patient movement of underground streams across geological time. These subterranean spaces develop their own unique acoustic properties as they grow. Sound waves propagate through cave systems in ways that create natural resonance chambers, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others. The mathematical relationships between cave dimensions and their acoustic characteristics often produce harmonic ratios similar to those found in musical scales, creating underground environments where even the slightest sounds generate complex echoes and reverberations that can continue for minutes after the original sound has ended. The constant temperature conditions within deep caves provide some of the most stable environments on Earth's surface. Insulated by hundreds of meters of overlying rock, cave temperatures remain virtually constant throughout seasonal and even climatic variations, typically reflecting the average annual surface temperature of the region above. This thermal stability creates underground refugia, where biological processes can continue without interruption during surface environmental changes that would otherwise disrupt normal ecological functioning. Modern spelunkers and cave researchers discover that the silence within deep cave systems reaches levels impossible to achieve in surface environments. The combination of acoustic isolation from external sound sources and the sound-absorbing properties of limestone create spaces where the ambient noise level approaches the theoretical limits of quiet, measurable by scientific instruments. In these profound silences, visitors become aware of sounds normally masked by environmental background noise, the circulation of air through tiny rock crevices, the distant drip of water condensing from saturated air, the subtle settling sounds of rock formations adjusting to imperceptible changes in pressure and temperature. The biological communities that develop in cave environments evolve under conditions of perpetual darkness and constant temperature that eliminate many of the environmental variables that drive evolution in surface habitats. Cave organisms develop enhanced sensitivities to chemical gradients, air currents, and vibrations, creating sensory capabilities that far exceed those of their surface relatives. Many cave species lose pigmentation and visual systems entirely, redirecting metabolic resources toward enhanced chemical sensing and mechanical perception systems better suited to navigation in absolute darkness. The relationship between cave formations and underground water systems creates natural networks of connected chambers that can extend for hundreds of kilometers through limestone formations. These underground river systems move through cave networks at speeds so slow that individual water molecules may spend years traveling from one cave chamber to another. The leisurely circulation creates chemical environments where dissolved minerals have extended opportunities to interact and precipitate into the spectacular formations that decorate cave interiors with crystal gardens grown over millennia. Scientists studying cave atmospheres find that the air chemistry within cave systems differs significantly from surface atmospheric composition. Higher humidity levels and different concentrations of carbon dioxide create breathing environments that affect human physiology in subtle ways, often producing feelings of relaxation and altered consciousness that may result from the combination of modified air chemistry, sensory deprivation, and the psychological effects of profound quiet and darkness. The mystery of how caves affect human consciousness and perception involves complex interactions between environmental factors and neurological responses to sensory isolation. Research subjects spending extended periods in cave environments report changes in sleep patterns, time perception, and states of awareness that suggest caves naturally induce altered states of consciousness similar to those achieved through meditation or other consciousness-modifying practices. Only took 10 million years for the largest cave systems to reach their current dimensions. Only required the patience of slightly acidic water, slowly dissolving limestone formations grain by mineral grain. Only needed the kind of chemical persistence that makes even erosion seem rapid by comparison. The caves continue expanding today, their growth proceeding at rates measured in millimeters per century as underground waters continue their patient architectural work. The formation of speleothems, the stalactites, stalagmites, and flowstone formations that decorate cave interiors occurs through processes so gradual that individual formations preserve detailed climate records spanning thousands of years. Each microscopic layer of mineral deposition reflects the exact chemical composition of the water that deposited it, creating stone archives that record variations in rainfall, surface temperature, and atmospheric composition with annual resolution extending back through multiple ice ages and warm periods. The acoustic properties of cave systems create natural sound environments that have influenced human cultural development in regions where caves provide shelter or spiritual significance. The resonant frequencies of cave chambers naturally amplify human vocal ranges, particularly the low-frequency sounds associated with chanting, singing, and other ritualistic vocalizations. These acoustic effects may have contributed to the widespread use of caves as sites for ceremonial activities and spiritual practices across many different cultures throughout human history. The air circulation patterns within cave systems operate through natural ventilation mechanisms driven by temperature differences between cave air and surface atmospheric conditions. During certain seasons and weather conditions, caves breathe like sleeping lungs, drawing surface air deep into their interior chambers and exhaling stale air through different openings. These natural ventilation cycles create subtle air currents that can be felt throughout cave systems, providing sensory cues that cave organisms use for navigation and environmental monitoring. The mineral formations within caves grow through crystallization processes that require conditions of extraordinary chemical stability and freedom from vibration or disturbance. The most delicate formations, thin soda straws and gossamer-like cave pearls, can only form in locations where the supporting cave structure remains absolutely motionless for centuries, while mineral-laden water deposits crystals drop by microscopic drop. These fragile formations serve as indicators of the profound geological stability that characterizes the deepest cave environments. The electromagnetic properties of limestone cave systems create natural Faraday cages that shield their interiors from most forms of electromagnetic radiation. Cave environments provide some of the few places on Earth's surface where electronic instruments can measure natural background electromagnetic fields without interference from human-generated radio signals, power transmission, and other artificial electromagnetic sources. This electromagnetic isolation may contribute to the altered states of consciousness that many people report experiencing during extended cave visits. The temperature regulation systems that maintain constant cave climates operate through thermal mass effects that buffer cave environments against surface temperature variations. The enormous thermal mass of surrounding limestone formations absorbs and releases heat so slowly that cave temperatures reflect long-term averages of surface conditions rather than responding to daily, seasonal, or even annual temperature changes. This thermal inertia creates underground environments that preserve samples of regional climate conditions averaged over decades or centuries. The gravitational dance between Earth and Moon creates tidal forces that extend far beyond their obvious effects on ocean waters, subtly deforming the solid planet itself twice each day in rhythms that have persisted for billions of years. As the Moon orbits overhead, Its gravitational pull stretches the Earth's crust upward by several centimeters, creating tidal bulges in solid rock that follow the lunar position with mathematical precision. These crustal tides generate minute changes in the planet's shape that affect everything from the length of each day to the subtle variations in gravitational field strength that sensitive organisms might detect and respond to in their biological rhythms. The Moon's influence on Earth's rotation operates through tidal friction that gradually transfers angular momentum from the spinning planet to the orbiting satellite. This energy transfer manifests as an imperceptible slowing of Earth's rotation, lengthening each day by approximately 2 milliseconds per century. The process has been operating since the Moon's formation, when Earth days lasted only a few hours and the lunar companion hung close enough in the sky to appear 20 times larger than it does today. The gradual slowing of planetary rotation has profound implications for all biological rhythms that evolved in response to day-night cycles. Ancient tidal patterns, preserved in sedimentary rock formations that record the rhythm of prehistoric seas, reveal that early Earth experienced tidal forces far stronger than any modern organism has encountered. When the Moon orbited at half its current distance, tidal ranges reached heights that would have created twice-daily tsunamis across the planet's shallow seas. These extreme tides carved temporary channels thousands of kilometers inland, creating vast tidal flats where early life forms experienced dramatically rhythmic cycles of submersion and exposure that may have provided the environmental pressure needed to drive the evolution of complex biological timing systems. The relationship between lunar cycles and biological rhythms extends far beyond the obvious connections to ocean tides and nocturnal illumination. Research on modern organisms reveals subtle but measurable responses to lunar gravitational effects that operate independently of tidal water movement or moonlight intensity. Some of these responses appear to depend on direct gravitational influences on biological fluids or cellular structures, suggesting that organisms possess sensory mechanisms capable of detecting the minute gravitational variations that accompany lunar orbital cycles. Modern chronobiologists studying lunar influences on sleep discover that human rest patterns show statistical correlations with lunar phases that persist even in subjects isolated from environmental cues about moon position or illumination. These lunar sleep effects appear most prominently around the times of new and full moons, when tidal forces reach their monthly extremes and the gravitational influence of the Moon-Sun system creates maximum disturbance in the Earth's rotational stability. The mechanisms underlying these lunar sleep influences remain largely mysterious, but may involve sensitivity to the subtle electromagnetic or gravitational field variations that accompany tidal forces. The Moon's gravitational field creates standing wave patterns in the Earth's atmosphere that pulse with the same twice-daily rhythm as ocean tides. These atmospheric tides are too subtle to affect weather patterns significantly, but they create measurable variations in air pressure and density that cycle with lunar position. Some researchers theorize that organisms evolved sensitivity to these atmospheric pressure variations as another environmental cue for biological timing, adding lunar atmospheric rhythms to the complex suite of environmental signals that regulate circadian and tidal biological cycles. The electromagnetic effects of tidal forces involve complex interactions between the Moon's gravitational field and the Earth's magnetic field that create subtle variations in the planet's overall electromagnetic environment. As tidal bulges move through the Earth's crust, they carry electrically conductive materials through magnetic field lines, generating tiny electrical currents that pulse with tidal periodicity. These tidal electrical effects may provide another channel through which lunar cycles influence biological systems that have evolved electromagnetic sensitivity. Scientists examining the fossil record for evidence of ancient tidal influences find that many biological processes show cyclical patterns that correspond to the orbital periods of the ancient moon. Stromatolites' layered bacterial formations display growth patterns that reflect not only daily and seasonal cycles, but also lunar monthly rhythms that match the orbital period of the moon at the time they formed. These fossilized tidal records provide direct evidence that lunar influences on biological timing have operated continuously throughout the history of life on Earth. The mystery of how organisms first evolved sensitivity to lunar gravitational effects involves cellular mechanisms that can detect the minute mechanical forces created by tidal field variations. Research on gravitational biology reveals that even single cells can respond to acceleration changes as small as those created by lunar tidal effects, suggesting that gravitational sensitivity may be a fundamental property of biological systems rather than a specialized adaptation found only in certain organisms or environments. Only took 4 billion years for the moon to move far enough away that its tidal effects became gentle enough to allow the evolution of complex multicellular organisms. Only required the patience of gravitational mechanics, gradually reducing the intensity of tidal forces as orbital dynamics carried the lunar companion into higher, more distant orbits. Only needed the kind of cosmic fine-tuning that makes even planetary evolution seem rushed by comparison. The moon continues its slow retreat today, gradually weakening the tidal forces that have shaped biological rhythms since the earliest emergence of life. The coupling between lunar orbital mechanics and Earth's rotational dynamics creates complex periodicities that repeat on multiple timescales simultaneously. Daily tidal cycles combine with monthly lunar orbital variations and annual seasonal changes to produce intricate patterns of environmental rhythm that require sophisticated biological timing systems to track and respond to appropriately. These overlapping cycles create temporal environments of extraordinary complexity that may have provided the selective pressure needed to drive the evolution of the neural networks capable of processing multiple simultaneous timing signals. The ancient connection between tidal forces and the evolution of sleep may involve the physiological demands of surviving in environments where twice-daily tidal cycles created regular periods of environmental stress, followed by recovery intervals. Organisms living in tidal zones experience dramatic changes in temperature, pressure, salinity, and oxygen availability that cycle with the rhythm of advancing and retreating waters. The metabolic strategies needed to survive these regular stress cycles may have provided the evolutionary foundation for the alternating periods of activity and recovery that characterize modern sleep patterns. The gravitational influence of the moon on biological fluids creates tidal effects within organisms that parallel the tidal movements of ocean waters. Body fluids, including blood and cerebrospinal fluid, experience minute gravitational acceleration variations that cycle with lunar position. While these internal biological tides are far too small to affect normal physiological function directly, they may provide sensory information that organisms with appropriate sensitivity can use to track lunar cycles and coordinate biological activities with tidal and monthly rhythms. The long-term evolution of Earth-Moon tidal dynamics creates changing selection pressures that continuously reshape the biological timing systems of organisms living in tidal environments. As tidal forces gradually weaken due to the moon's outward spiral, organisms must continually readjust their tidal timing mechanisms to maintain synchronization with changing tidal patterns. This ongoing evolutionary pressure ensures that biological timing systems remain flexible and responsive to environmental change rather than becoming rigidly fixed to ancient tidal patterns that no longer match current tidal realities. Within the developing neural networks of early complex organisms, connections between individual nerve cells begin to form patterns that mirror the geometric arrangements found in crystalline mineral structures. The branching dendrites that extend from neural cell bodies grow according to mathematical principles that create three-dimensional architectures remarkably similar to the lattice structures that govern crystal formation in cooling magma chambers deep within the Earth's crust. These neural crystal patterns emerge through cellular processes that appear to follow the same geometric optimization principles that determine how atoms arrange themselves in mineral formations. The similarity between neural connectivity and crystal lattices extends beyond superficial geometric resemblance to include fundamental organizational principles that operate across vastly different scales of biological and geological organization. Both neural networks and crystal structures develop through processes that minimize energy expenditure while maximizing functional efficiency, creating architectures that achieve optimal performance through elegant mathematical arrangements. The hexagonal patterns that characterize many crystal formations appear repeatedly in the organization of neural circuits, particularly in brain regions responsible for spatial navigation and memory formation. Modern neuroscientists studying brain connectivity patterns discover that the most efficient neural networks develop structures that closely resemble the molecular arrangements found in naturally occurring crystals. The branching patterns of neural dendrites, the clustering arrangements of synaptic connections, and the three-dimensional geometry of neural circuits all show clear mathematical relationships to crystal formation principles. This suggests that the same physical laws that govern mineral formation also influence the development of nervous systems, creating brains that are literally built according to crystalline architectural principles. The relationship between neural organization and mineral structures becomes particularly evident in brain regions responsible for processing temporal information and coordinating circadian rhythms. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, which serves as the master biological clock in mammalian brains, develops connectivity patterns that mirror the geometric arrangements found in piezoelectric crystals, minerals that generate electrical fields in response to mechanical stress. This structural similarity may help explain why biological timing systems show such precise synchronization with electromagnetic rhythms generated by crystalline formations in the Earth's crust. The electrical properties of neural networks bear striking resemblances to the electromagnetic characteristics of certain mineral crystals. Both systems generate electrical fields through the movement of charged particles across organized boundaries. Both exhibit resonance phenomena at specific frequencies, and both demonstrate the capacity to store and transmit information through electromagnetic signaling. The neural oscillations that characterize different brain states, including the slow waves associated with deep sleep, occur at frequencies that correspond to the natural resonance frequencies of common rock-forming minerals. The developmental processes that shape neural connectivity during brain formation appear to follow template patterns that exist independently of genetic programming. Laboratory studies reveal that neurons growing in artificial environments naturally organize themselves into crystalline arrangements even when isolated from normal developmental cues. This suggests that neural organization reflects fundamental physical principles rather than purely biological programming, creating brain architectures that emerge from the same geometric constraints that determine crystal formation patterns. Scientists examining the fossil record find that the earliest nervous systems developed in organisms living in environments rich with crystalline mineral formations. Ancient marine environments where the first complex neural networks evolved contained high concentrations of dissolved silica, calcium, and other mineral components that readily form crystals under appropriate conditions. The chemical environment that supported early neural development provided abundant templates for crystalline organization that may have influenced the geometric principles governing neural connectivity. The mystery of how neural networks first began to exhibit crystalline organization involves complex interactions between cellular development and the physical environment in which early nervous systems evolved. Modern research reveals that developing neurons are sensitive to electromagnetic fields, chemical gradients, and mechanical forces that can influence their growth patterns and connectivity arrangements. The presence of natural crystal formations in early marine environments may have provided organizing influences that shaped neural development according to crystalline geometric principles. Only took 500 million years for neural networks to develop the crystalline organization patterns that characterize modern brains. Only required the patience of cellular development, gradually discovering the geometric principles that optimize information processing and energy efficiency. Only needed the kind of architectural refinement that makes even embryonic development seem hasty by comparison. The neural crystalline patterns that develop still reflect the mineral formation principles established in the Earth's earliest cooling magma chambers. The information storage capabilities of neural networks show remarkable parallels to the data preservation functions of crystalline structures. Both systems can maintain stable information patterns across extended time periods while remaining capable of modification when appropriate stimuli are applied. The synaptic modifications that underlie memory formation in neural networks operate through mechanisms that resemble the phase transitions that allow crystals to switch between different structural configurations while maintaining their basic organizational integrity. The resonance properties of neural circuits create electromagnetic oscillations that can synchronize with the natural frequencies generated by crystalline formations in the Earth's crust and atmosphere. During certain brain states, particularly the synchronized neural activity that characterizes deep sleep, neural oscillations align with the electromagnetic rhythms generated by piezoelectric crystals, atmospheric electrical phenomena, and the planet's natural electromagnetic field variations. This synchronization may provide a mechanism through which neural activity maintains connection with planetary electromagnetic rhythms. The hierarchical organization of neural networks mirrors the nested geometric patterns found in complex crystal structures. Both systems develop multiple levels of organization that operate simultaneously, from individual connections between neurons to large-scale circuits spanning entire brain regions, paralleling the organization of crystal structures from individual atoms to molecular clusters to macroscopic crystal faces. This hierarchical similarity suggests that both neural and crystalline organization follow universal principles of complex system development. The repair and regeneration processes that maintain neural networks throughout an organism's lifetime operate through mechanisms similar to those that allow crystal structures to heal from damage and continue growing despite disruptions to their formation processes. Neural plasticity. The capacity of neural circuits to reorganize and adapt to changing conditions resembles the ability of crystal formations to incorporate new material while maintaining their underlying geometric organization, creating systems that remain stable while adapting to changing conditions. The electrical conductivity of neural networks depends on the same ionic mechanisms that create electrical properties in certain types of crystals. The movement of sodium, potassium, and calcium ions across neural membranes generates electrical currents through processes that parallel the ionic conduction mechanisms found in crystalline materials. This suggests that the electrical properties of nervous systems evolve through adaptation of electrochemical principles that operate universally in organized ionic systems, whether biological or geological. The frequency characteristics of neural oscillations span ranges that include the natural resonance frequencies of many common minerals, creating opportunities for direct electromagnetic coupling between neural activity and crystalline formations in the environment. This electromagnetic resonance may provide a mechanism through which neural networks can maintain synchronization with environmental rhythms that operate independently of sensory input, creating direct electromagnetic connections between consciousness and the mineral foundations of planetary structure. In the ancient sedimentary layers that preserve Earth's biological history, paleontologists discover fossilized evidence of rest behaviors that extend back hundreds of millions of years into the planet's past. Trilobites, those segmented marine arthropods that dominated Paleozoic seas, left behind fossilized traces of their daily activity cycles preserved in the fine-grained limestone that formed from prehistoric ocean sediments. These trace fossils reveal periods of reduced activity that alternate with more energetic phases, creating fossilized records of some of the earliest sleep-like behaviors in complex multicellular organisms. The preservation of behavioral patterns in sedimentary rock requires extraordinary conditions, where the finest details of organismal activity become captured in mineral form before decay or disturbance can erase the evidence. Certain ancient environments, particularly the oxygen-poor bottom waters of shallow seas, created chemical conditions that rapidly mineralized organic tissues and behavioral traces. Essentially, freezing moments of prehistoric life in stone matrices that preserve temporal information across hundreds of millions of years. These fossilized rest patterns appear in multiple forms throughout the geological record. Some manifest as periodic variations in the feeding traces left by ancient organisms as they move through seafloor sediments, with regular intervals of intensive burrowing activity separated by periods when trace-making virtually ceased. Other behavioral fossils show clustering patterns where individuals of the same species gathered in specific locations during apparent rest periods, creating fossil assemblages that suggest coordinated group resting behaviors similar to modern animal sleep aggregations. The cyclical nature of these ancient rest patterns corresponds closely to the day-night rhythms that would have characterized the prehistoric environments where these organisms lived. Trace fossils from organisms that lived in shallow marine environments show clear evidence of activity cycles that match the approximately 24-hour day length that prevailed during their time periods. This suggests that circadian regulation of rest and activity has been a fundamental aspect of animal behavior for most of the history of complex life on Earth. Modern paleobiologists studying these behavioral fossils discover that the earliest evidence of coordinated rest behaviors appears in the fossil record at approximately the same time as the first development of complex nervous systems. This temporal correlation suggests that the evolution of centralized neural control systems provided the biological foundation necessary for organisms to coordinate their activity and rest periods in response to environmental rhythms rather than simply responding to immediate local conditions. The fossilization process itself provides insights into the biochemistry of ancient rest behaviors. Certain minerals that form during fossil preservation show chemical signatures that correspond to the metabolic byproducts associated with reduced cellular activity. These chemical fossils preserve molecular evidence of the physiological changes that accompanied ancient rest behaviors, creating geochemical archives that document the evolution of sleep-related metabolic processes across evolutionary time. The geographical distribution of rest behavior fossils reveals that these patterns developed independently in multiple lineages living in different marine environments around the prehistoric world. This convergent evolution of rest behaviors suggests that the advantages of coordinated activity and quiescence periods created strong selection pressures that favored the development of sleep-like behaviors across diverse ecological niches and taxonomic groups. Scientists examining the fine-scale temporal resolution of behavioral trace fossils find evidence that ancient organisms maintained remarkably precise timing in their activity cycles. Some fossilized burrow systems show activity patterns that repeat with precision comparable to modern circadian rhythms, indicating that even early complex organisms possessed sophisticated internal timing mechanisms capable of maintaining accurate biological clocks across extended periods. The mystery of how behavioral information becomes preserved in fossil form involves complex interactions between organism activity, sediment chemistry, and the environmental conditions that determine whether behavioral traces become mineralized before they are destroyed by decay or disturbance. Research on modern trace formation reveals that behavioral fossils require very specific conditions of rapid burial and chemical stabilization that occur only in certain depositional environments. Only took 50 million years for complex rest behaviors to evolve from simple activity variations into the coordinated sleep patterns found in early vertebrates. Only required the patience of neural evolution gradually developing the circuitry necessary to integrate environmental timing cues with internal metabolic cycles. Only needed the kind of behavioral refinement that makes even instinct development seem rapid by comparison. The fossilized rest patterns that develop still reflect the basic circadian timing mechanisms established in much simpler organisms. The preservation of group rest behaviors in fossil assemblages provides evidence that social coordination of sleep patterns developed very early in the evolution of complex animal behavior. Fossil sites containing multiple individuals of the same species in resting postures suggest that coordinated group sleep, with its advantages for predator detection and thermal regulation, represents an ancient behavioral strategy rather than a recent evolutionary innovation found only in highly social modern species. The relationship between fossilized rest behaviors and ancient environmental conditions reveals that sleep patterns have consistently adapted to the specific challenges of different ecological niches throughout evolutionary history. Organisms living in high-energy environments like wave-swept shorelines developed rest patterns that differed significantly from those found in organisms inhabiting the quieter conditions of deep seafloor environments, creating diversity in ancient sleep strategies that parallels the ecological diversity of rest behaviors found in modern ecosystems. The chemical composition of sediments surrounding behavioral trace fossils provides information about the oxygen levels, temperature conditions, and nutrient availability that characterized ancient rest environments. This geochemical context reveals that many early rest behaviors developed in environments with reduced oxygen availability, where metabolic rate reduction during rest periods may have provided crucial advantages for surviving in chemically challenging conditions. The microscopic analysis of fossilized rest traces reveals cellular-level details of ancient physiological processes that accompanied behavioral quiescence. Some behavioral fossils preserve evidence of reduced metabolic activity at the cellular level, including changes in cellular structure and chemistry that correspond to the physiological modifications associated with modern sleep states. These cellular fossils provide direct evidence that the metabolic aspects of sleep evolved alongside the behavioral patterns of rest and activity. The stratigraphic distribution of rest behavior fossils shows that these patterns have remained remarkably stable throughout major environmental changes and mass extinction events that eliminated many other aspects of ancient ecosystems. The persistence of circadian rest behaviors across geological time suggests that these patterns represent fundamental adaptations to planetary environmental rhythms rather than responses to specific ecological conditions that might change with evolutionary time. The integration of behavioral fossil data with information about ancient atmospheric conditions, ocean chemistry, and climate patterns creates comprehensive pictures of how rest behaviors adapted to the changing planetary environment throughout Earth's history. These paleo-environmental reconstructions reveal that sleep patterns have consistently tracked environmental rhythms even as the specific characteristics of those rhythms have changed due to planetary evolution, atmospheric development, and the gradual slowing of Earth's rotation. The ancient atmosphere of Earth contained pressures and gas concentrations that created breathing environments fundamentally different from those experienced by modern organisms. During the Carboniferous period, atmospheric pressure reached levels nearly twice those found today, while oxygen concentrations climbed to 35% compared to the current 21%. These dense, oxygen-rich conditions supported respiratory processes that operated with efficiencies unknown to contemporary biology, creating physiological environments where organisms could extract far more energy from each breath than modern atmospheric conditions allow. The relationship between atmospheric pressure and the depth of respiratory cycles creates direct connections between planetary atmospheric evolution and the development of restful breathing patterns. Higher atmospheric pressures allow organisms to extract the same amount of oxygen from smaller volumes of air, reducing the work required for breathing and creating conditions where slower, deeper respiratory rhythms become energetically advantageous. These ancient atmospheric conditions may have provided the evolutionary foundation for the slow, deep breathing patterns that characterize restful states in modern organisms. The oxygen-rich atmosphere of prehistoric Earth supported metabolic processes that operated at rates far exceeding those possible under current atmospheric conditions. Cellular respiration systems evolved in environments where oxygen availability never limited metabolic rate, creating biochemical pathways optimized for maximum energy extraction rather than oxygen conservation. When atmospheric oxygen levels later declined to modern concentrations, organisms retained metabolic machinery designed for high oxygen conditions, creating physiological systems that operate most efficiently during periods of enhanced oxygen delivery. Modern respiratory physiologists studying the effects of atmospheric pressure on breathing patterns discover that even small increases in air pressure produce measurable changes in respiratory rhythm and depth. Subjects breathing air at pressures slightly above sea level, atmospheric conditions spontaneously adopt slower, deeper breathing patterns that resemble the respiratory rhythms associated with relaxation and sleep states. This suggests that the deeper breathing characteristic of restful states may reflect physiological adaptations to ancient atmospheric conditions that persist in modern respiratory control systems. The chemical composition of ancient atmospheres included trace gases that no longer exist in significant concentrations in modern air. Volcanic outgassing during periods of intense geological activity added hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, and various organic compounds to atmospheric mixtures that created breathing environments with complex chemical properties. Some of these atmospheric components may have possessed mild sedative effects that enhanced the restful qualities of breathing ancient air, creating environmental conditions that naturally promoted relaxation and reduced activity states. The pressure variations that accompany changes in weather patterns create atmospheric breathing environments that fluctuate on daily and seasonal timescales. High-pressure weather systems compress atmospheric gases to densities that enhance oxygen delivery efficiency, while low-pressure systems create conditions where breathing requires more effort to achieve the same level of oxygenation. These natural pressure variations may provide environmental cues that organisms use to adjust their activity levels and rest patterns in response to changing atmospheric conditions. Scientists examining the relationship between atmospheric pressure and sleep quality find that humans sleep more deeply and experience fewer sleep disruptions at slightly elevated atmospheric pressures. The improved sleep quality at higher pressures appears to result from enhanced oxygen delivery that reduces the respiratory effort required during sleep, allowing breathing patterns to slow and deepen without compromising oxygenation. This pressure-sleep relationship may reflect evolutionary adaptations to the higher atmospheric pressures that characterized much of Earth's biological history. The mystery of how organisms first develop sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes involves specialized cellular mechanisms that can detect the mechanical effects of pressure variations on cell membranes and fluid-filled organs. Modern research reveals that many organisms possess pressure-sensitive systems that respond to barometric changes too subtle for conscious detection, suggesting that atmospheric pressure sensitivity represents a fundamental biological capability rather than a specialized adaptation found only in certain species. Only took 100 million years for atmospheric pressure to decline from its ancient peaks to modern levels, as geological outgassing decreased and atmospheric gases gradually escaped to space. Only required the patience of planetary atmosphere evolution, slowly reducing the density of air while biological systems adapted to progressively more challenging breathing conditions. Only needed the kind of atmospheric adjustment that makes even climate change seem sudden by comparison. The respiratory systems that develop still reflect optimization for the denser atmospheric conditions that supported early complex life. The altitude-dependent variations in atmospheric pressure create natural laboratories where the effects of pressure on breathing and rest patterns can be observed in modern environments. Organisms living at high altitudes, where atmospheric pressure approximates ancient sea-level conditions, often exhibit breathing patterns and rest behaviors that differ significantly from those found in low-altitude populations. These altitude adaptations may preserve physiological strategies that were more widespread when atmospheric pressures were universally higher. The seasonal variations in atmospheric pressure that accompany changing weather patterns create cyclical environments where breathing conditions fluctuate in predictable annual patterns. During certain seasons, particularly those characterized by stable high-pressure weather systems, atmospheric conditions temporarily approach the denser, oxygen-rich environments that supported early biological evolution. These seasonal pressure variations may trigger physiological responses that reflect ancient atmospheric adaptations. The interaction between atmospheric pressure and the dissolved gas content of body fluids creates internal chemical environments that change with external barometric conditions. Higher atmospheric pressures increase the solubility of gases in blood and other body fluids, enhancing oxygen transport efficiency while also affecting the distribution of carbon dioxide and other metabolic gases. These pressure-dependent changes in internal chemistry may influence neural activity and consciousness states through mechanisms that operate independently of respiratory rate and depth. The acoustic properties of dense atmospheres create sound transmission environments that differ significantly from those found under modern atmospheric conditions. Sound travels faster and propagates over longer distances through dense air, creating acoustic environments where communication and sound perception operate through different physical principles. The enhanced sound transmission properties of ancient atmospheres may have influenced the evolution of auditory systems and the sound-based communication systems that many organisms use to coordinate rest and activity periods. The relationship between atmospheric composition and the chemical processes that regulate sleep involves complex interactions between breathing gases and the biochemical pathways that produce sleep-regulating neurotransmitters. Certain atmospheric trace gases can influence the synthesis and breakdown of molecules like melatonin and serotonin, creating direct chemical connections between atmospheric composition and sleep chemistry. These atmospheric neurochemical interactions may explain why sleep quality varies with weather conditions and atmospheric pressure changes. The preservation of ancient atmospheric compositions in ice cores and sedimentary rocks provides detailed records of the breathing environments that supported biological evolution throughout Earth's history. These paleoclimate archives reveal that atmospheric pressure and composition have undergone dramatic changes that required continuous physiological adaptation by evolving organisms. The respiratory systems that survive these atmospheric changes carry biochemical traces of adaptation to the diverse breathing environments that characterized different periods of Earth's atmospheric evolution. The great cycles of geological time begin to slow as the planet settles into the stable patterns that will characterize its modern epoch. Continental drift reaches speeds measured in centimeters per year, rather than the dramatic reshuffling that marked earlier eras. Volcanic activity retreats to predictable zones along tectonic boundaries, no longer capable of the massive outpourings that once reshaped entire atmospheric compositions within geological moments. The Earth's rotation stabilizes at its current 24-hour rhythm. Having gradually slowed from the rapid spinning of its youth through billions of years of tidal friction with its lunar companion, ocean circulation patterns establish their contemporary configurations, as continents assume positions that create the familiar geography of modern seas. The great currents that transport heat and nutrients around the planet develop into the stable loops and gyres that will persist for millions of years with only minor variations. Deep water formation in polar regions creates vertical circulation patterns that bring oxygen to abyssal depths, while carrying nutrients upward to surface waters, establishing the three-dimensional ocean movements that support modern marine ecosystems. Atmospheric composition reaches the stable concentrations that will support the evolution of complex terrestrial life. Oxygen levels settle near the 21% that provides optimal conditions for multicellular metabolism without creating the fire-prone environments that characterized earlier high-oxygen periods. Carbon dioxide concentrations find equilibrium points where they can maintain greenhouse warming sufficient to prevent global glaciation while allowing ice caps to form and retreat in response to orbital variations that cycle on timescales of tens of thousands of years. The magnetic field achieves a relatively stable configuration with its dipolar structure centered roughly on the planet's rotational axis. While the magnetic poles continue to wander and occasionally reverse, these changes now occur over timescales long enough that organisms can adapt to gradual shifts rather than experiencing the rapid magnetic chaos that characterized earlier geological periods. The magnetosphere maintains its protective envelope around the planet, deflecting cosmic radiation and preserving the atmospheric chemistry needed for complex biological processes. Climate systems develop the periodic oscillations that create reliable seasonal patterns across different latitude zones. The monsoons that bring predictable annual rainfall to vast continental regions establish their rhythms. The ice ages that advance and retreat on Milankovitch cycles create long-term climate variations that remain stable enough for biological communities to track and adapt to their changing conditions. Weather patterns achieve the statistical reliability that allows organisms to evolve behavioral and physiological responses calibrated to predictable environmental variations. Modern chronobiologists studying the biological clocks that evolved during this period of planetary stabilization discover circadian mechanisms of extraordinary precision and complexity. The molecular machinery that tracks daily time operates through feedback loops involving dozens of genes and proteins, creating biological timepieces accurate enough to anticipate environmental changes hours before they occur. These internal clocks synchronize not only with daily light-dark cycles, but also with temperature variations, humidity changes, and the subtle electromagnetic rhythms generated by the planet's stabilized geophysical systems. The integration of multiple environmental timing cues creates biological clocks capable of maintaining accurate time even when individual environmental signals become temporarily unreliable. Organisms develop internal calendars that can track seasonal progressions through multiple independent mechanisms, creating temporal navigation systems robust enough to function during periods of environmental disruption while remaining sensitive enough to track the subtle variations in environmental timing that characterize different geographical locations and ecological niches. Scientists examining the fossil record from this period of geological stabilization find evidence of increasingly sophisticated biological timing systems that could coordinate complex behaviors across multiple temporal scales simultaneously. Organisms begin to exhibit annual migration patterns, multi-year reproductive cycles, and behavioral responses to environmental rhythms that operate on decadal and longer timescales. The biological capacity for long-term temporal planning appears to evolve alongside the increasingly predictable environmental patterns of the stabilizing planet. The mystery of how organisms first began to integrate the multiple timing signals available in stable planetary environments involves the evolution of hierarchical biological clocks that can process environmental information operating on different temporal scales. Research on modern circadian systems reveals master clocks that coordinate subsidiary timing mechanisms, specialized for different environmental rhythms, creating temporal processing systems of remarkable sophistication and flexibility. Only took 50 million years for planetary systems to achieve the stability that supports the complex ecosystems of the modern world. Only required the patience of geological processes gradually settling into sustainable equilibrium configurations that could persist across evolutionary timescales. Only needed the kind of systematic stabilization that makes even climate variability seem chaotic by comparison. The stable planetary patterns that develop create the environmental foundation for all subsequent biological evolution. The establishment of stable environmental rhythms creates ecological niches based primarily on temporal rather than spatial characteristics. Organisms begin to specialize for activity during specific times of day, particular seasons, or certain phases of longer environmental cycles, creating temporal partitioning of resources that allows multiple species to coexist in the same physical spaces by occupying different temporal territories. These time-based ecological strategies become as important as spatial habitat preferences in determining community structure and species interactions. The predictability of environmental rhythms enables the evolution of anticipatory biological responses that prepare organisms for environmental changes before they occur. Physiological processes begin to shift in preparation for seasonal transitions weeks before temperature or daylight patterns actually change. Migration behaviors commence based on internal calendar systems rather than immediate environmental cues. Sleep patterns adjust to seasonal daylight variations through gradual modifications that track the changing photoperiod rather than responding abruptly to individual day-length measurements. The development of stable planetary rhythms creates opportunities for biological synchronization across vast geographical scales. Species separated by thousands of kilometers can coordinate reproductive timing, migration schedules, and other behaviors through shared responses to global environmental rhythms that operate with consistent timing across entire continents. These large-scale biological synchronization phenomena create planetary-scale ecological patterns that depend on the stable environmental rhythms established during this period of geological maturation. The emergence of complex rest behaviors that integrate multiple environmental timing cues represents one of the most sophisticated biological responses to planetary stability. Sleep patterns that respond simultaneously to daily light-dark cycles, monthly lunar rhythms, seasonal daylight variations, and longer-term climate oscillations create biological timing systems capable of maintaining optimal physiological function across the full range of temporal scales that characterize stable planetary environments. In the deepest chambers of time, where geological moments stretch beyond the reach of memory, the ancient rhythms continue their patient work. Crystals grow atom by atom in darkness so complete that light itself has never been invented. Tides that once moved mountains now whisper across quiet shores, their lunar clockwork keeping time for a world that has learned the art of rest. The Earth turns through space on its axis, wobbling slightly with the accumulated patience of 4.5 billion years of practice. Deep underground, water moves through passages carved one grain at a time, carrying dissolved mountains toward destinations it will not reach for 1,000 more centuries. The magnetic field breathes through cycles longer than the rise and fall of entire evolutionary lineages, protecting the thin membrane of atmosphere that holds all sleeping creatures in its gentle embrace. In limestone caverns older than complex life itself, silence accumulates like sediment, layering moment upon moment of perfect quiet into galleries that exist purely to hold the absence of sound. The calcium that once danced in primordial seas now flows through the neural networks of dreaming organisms, carrying molecular messages through pathways that mirror the crystal lattices where it first learned the geometry of order. Melatonin molecules synthesized from the same basic chemistry that sustained the planet's earlier cells continue to translate darkness into the biochemical language of rest. The atmosphere settles into its nightly stillness, pressure systems breathing slowly across continents as air masses older than mountains move through circulation patterns that have forgotten their own beginning. In fossil beds scattered across the continents, the stone archives of ancient sleep lie perfectly preserved, waiting with geological patience for someone to read the record of how rest first learned to synchronize with the spinning of the world. The moon continues its slow retreat, each passing year carrying it millimeters farther from the Earth that it once held so close. The tidal forces that once created twice-daily tsunamis now generate the gentlest possible reminder of the gravitational embrace that shaped the first biological rhythms. Time itself moves differently here in the deep quiet, each second containing eons, each breath connecting the sleeper to the original atmosphere of cooling volcanic outgassing and the patient chemistry of stone, learning to dissolve into underground rivers that flow toward no particular destination. The great cycles settle into their eternal patterns, too vast to perceive directly, but intimate enough to be felt in the slowing of thought, the deepening of breath, the gradual surrender to rhythms older than consciousness itself. Everything sleeps. The crystals sleep in their matrix of cooling stone. The deep aquifers sleep through their millennial circulation patterns. The magnetic field sleeps through its polarity reversals. The continents sleep as they drift across the surface of the deep earth at speeds that make even erosion seem hurried. In this deepest sleep, all the ancient processes continue their work, requiring no awareness, no intention, only the inexorable patience of matter itself gradually finding its most restful arrangement. The story ends where it began, in darkness and silence, and the kind of stillness that makes even geological time seem restless by comparison. Here, in the deepest chambers of planetary sleep, every atom dreams the same dream of perfect rest, and time moves slowly enough that even sleep itself can finally sleep,